Single dad waiter gets yelled at by billionaire CEO. What he says next freezes the entire internet. A single drop of coffee hit the table. That's all it took. The woman in the corner booth exploded like a bomb. Dirty, clumsy. People like you only deserve to serve for life. Her voice cut through Hometown Diner like broken glass. Every customer froze. Phones came out. Recording started. Marcus stood there in his old white shirt, calloused hands steady, sad eyes unwavering. Then he looked straight into her ice-cold stare and spoke with a voice that could freeze hell itself. Grace Blackstone always said her mother was the coldest person in the world. But she was wrong. You're more cruel than that. You killed your daughter twice. First, when you disowned her. Second, when you refused to pay for her cancer treatment. The billionaire CEO's face went death white. A 6-year-old girl with piercing blue eyes burst through the back door, calling Daddy. What's wrong? Eleanor Blackstone whispered one word that changed everything. Grace? 3 days before that moment would shatter 2 lives and rebuild them again, Marcus Thompson had been sketching water distribution patterns on a coffee-stained napkin. The morning rush at Hometown Diner had ended, leaving him with precious quiet minutes to work on the designs that consumed his thoughts. His weathered fingers moved the pencil with practiced precision, creating intricate diagrams that looked like abstract art to the casual observer. These weren't the random doodles of a bored waiter. These were sophisticated irrigation schematics that could transform the dying farmland surrounding Willow Creek, Texas. The town was suffocating under the worst drought in living memory. Farms that had fed generations of families now sat barren and cracked, their soil too depleted to sustain even the hardiest crops. Main Street businesses shuttered one by one as families packed up and moved to cities where water flowed from taps and hope hadn't become a luxury. The diner served as an unofficial town hall, where farmers gathered each morning to share increasingly desperate stories about failed wells and mounting debt. Marcus folded the napkin carefully and slipped it into his apron pocket as Betty Martinez approached his station. She was the diner's afternoon waitress, a woman in her 50s whose gentle smile never quite reached her worried eyes. "You've been drawing again," she observed, not unkindly. "Whatever those pictures are, they must be pretty important for you to work on them every spare minute." Marcus had been her colleague for 18 months, but he'd never shared the truth about his background or the significance of his sketches. "Just keeping my hands busy," Marcus replied, the same deflection he'd used dozens of times before. Betty nodded but didn't press further. She'd learned to respect the boundaries that grief had built around him. Everyone in town knew the basic story. Young widower, brain cancer, left with a 6-year-old daughter and medical bills that would crush a small nation. What they didn't know was that Marcus held degrees from Stanford University, that he'd once been considered a rising star in agricultural engineering, that the solutions sketched on discarded napkins could revolutionize farming across the Southwest. The black BMW appeared in the parking lot like a dark omen against the faded pickup trucks and rust bucket sedans that typically occupied the spaces outside Hometown Diner. Marcus watched through the window as a woman emerged from the driver's seat, her movements sharp and economical. Everything about her screamed money and authority. The tailored blazer that probably cost more than Marcus made in 3 months, the leather briefcase that gleamed with newness, the way she surveyed the modest building, as if calculating its worth down to the penny. Eleanor Blackstone had driven 8 hours from Dallas, following a lead that had taken her private investigator 6 months to develop. The report mentioned a Grace Hayes who had lived in Willow Creek, had taught at the local elementary school, had died of cancer approximately 18 months earlier. The investigator had been careful to note that Hayes was a common surname, that this might be another false lead in a 7-year search. But Eleanor's instincts, honed by decades in corporate warfare, told her this was different. She pushed through the diner's front door with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. The conversations around her didn't exactly stop, but they muted noticeably as curious eyes assessed this obvious outsider. Eleanor chose the corner booth, the one that provided the best vantage point for observing the staff and customers. She needed to understand what could have possibly attracted her sophisticated, well-educated daughter to this nowhere place. Marcus approached her table with a practiced smile and a clean coffee cup. Up close, Eleanor's wealth was even more apparent, the subtle designer jewelry, the perfect makeup that had probably taken an hour to apply, the manicure that spoke of weekly salon appointments, and a life free from manual labor. "Good morning," Marcus said politely. "Coffee to start?" His voice carried the slight hoarseness that had never quite left after months of crying himself to sleep during Grace's illness. "Black coffee," Eleanor replied curtly, already pulling out her phone to check messages. And I'll need the strongest Wi-Fi password you have. I assume this place actually has internet? The dismissive tone was automatic, the verbal equivalent of swatting away an annoying insect. Marcus had encountered this attitude before, usually from tourists passing through who couldn't fathom how anyone could choose to live in such a backward place. The password is community, all lowercase, Marcus said, filling her cup with steady hands. And yes, we have decent internet. The whole town got together and upgraded the infrastructure about 3 years ago. Sometimes working together accomplishes more than going it alone. The gentle rebuke was so subtle that Eleanor almost missed it, but something in his tone made her look up from her phone screen. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Eleanor felt an odd flicker of something. Recognition wasn't quite the right word, since she'd never seen this man before in her life. But there was an intelligence in his gaze that surprised her, a depth that didn't match her assumptions about small-town waiters. Marcus looked away first, refilling water glasses at nearby tables with the unhurried efficiency of someone who took pride in doing simple tasks well. Eleanor spent the next hour observing the dynamic between Marcus and the other customers. She watched him refill old Pete's coffee cup 3 times without being asked, listened as he inquired about the elderly farmer's grandson who was stationed overseas. She saw him slip an extra biscuit onto Sarah Martinez's plate when he thought no one was looking, knowing the young mother was stretching her dollars to cover both breakfast and her daughter's lunch money for school. These weren't the interactions of a desperate man groveling for tips. This was someone who genuinely cared about the people around him, who had become woven into the fabric of this small community in ways that Eleanor found both puzzling and slightly irritating. She'd spent 7 years convincing herself that Grace's choice had been motivated by naive romanticism, that her daughter would eventually recognize the harsh realities of life without family money and connections. But watching Marcus move through his workday with quiet competence and genuine warmth, Eleanor began to wonder if her assumptions had been wrong. This wasn't the gold-digging loser she'd imagined. This was someone who commanded respect through kindness rather than intimidation, who had found ways to contribute to his community that had nothing to do with bank account balances or social status. The revelation came gradually, pieced together through overheard conversations and careful questioning. Grace Hayes, beloved third-grade teacher. Grace Hayes, who had organized the school fundraiser that bought new playground equipment. Grace Hayes, who had fought brain cancer with such grace and dignity that the whole town had rallied around her family. Grace Hayes, who had left behind a husband and 6-year-old daughter when the disease finally claimed her 18 months ago. Eleanor's coffee grew cold as the mathematics of missed opportunities arranged themselves in her mind. Grace would have been 28 when she died, which meant she'd lived in this town for at least 7 years. 7 years of birthdays unacknowledged, of holidays spent alone, of a granddaughter Eleanor had never known existed. 7 years of prideful silence while her daughter built a life rich in everything except the material wealth the Blackstone name could provide. When the lunch rush died down, Eleanor found herself alone in the diner except for Marcus, who was methodically cleaning tables and resetting them for the evening crowd. She'd been nursing the same cup of coffee for 3 hours, paralyzed by the growing certainty that she'd found Grace's final resting place and evidence of a life that had been far more meaningful than the empty existence Eleanor had built for herself in her Manhattan penthouse. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Marcus looked up from the table he was wiping down, his expression politely attentive. "The teacher who passed away, Grace Hayes. Did you know her well?" The question felt like swallowing glass, each word sharp and painful in her throat. Marcus's face went very still. "She was my wife," he said simply. "Grace was. She was everything good about this place. Everything good about anywhere, really." He resumed cleaning the table, but his movements had become mechanical, automatic. "Can I ask why you're interested?" Grace didn't have many connections outside of Willow Creek. Eleanor felt the world tilt sideways. She'd found her daughter, but she was 18 months too late. "I think," she began, then stopped, unable to figure out how to explain 7 years of stubborn pride and devastating choices. "I think I may have known her family. Before she came here, before she became Grace Hayes." The words came out stilted and formal, corporate speak, inadequate for the magnitude of what she was trying to communicate. "Grace's family cut her off when she married me," Marcus said, and now there was steel in his voice. "Her mother made it clear that choosing love over money meant choosing to be dead to the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. So no, I don't think you knew her family. Because Grace's family abandoned her when she needed them most. He moved to the next table, his cleaning more vigorous now, channeling grief and old anger into physical activity. Eleanor felt each word like a physical blow. She watched Marcus work and tried to reconcile the man in front of her with the worthless fortune hunter she'd imagined in her mind. His shirt was worn but clean, his movements economical and practiced, his obvious pain still raw even 18 months after loss. This wasn't someone who had seduced her daughter for financial gain. This was someone who had loved Grace enough to build a life with her in this modest place, far from the complications and expectations of the Blackstone legacy. Grace Blackstone, Eleanor whispered, testing the sound of her daughter's maiden name in the space between them. Marcus's hands stilled on the table's surface. That was her name before she married you. Grace Blackstone. She watched recognition dawn in his eyes, followed quickly by suspicion and something that might have been anger. You're Eleanor Blackstone. It wasn't a question. Marcus straightened slowly, the cleaning rag forgotten in his hands. You're the mother who told Grace she was dead to you if she married me. The one who hung up when she called to tell you about Lily's birth. The one who... He trailed off, clearly struggling with words adequate to express 7 years of accumulated fury. Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze, though every instinct screamed at her to look away, to retreat, to protect herself from the justified anger she saw building in his expression. Yes, she said simply. I'm Eleanor Blackstone, and I've spent 7 years convincing myself I made the right choice. She paused, her voice barely above a whisper. I was wrong about everything. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything either of them had expected. Marcus demanded to know why she'd come, what she wanted, whether she intended to disrupt the life he'd built with Lily in the wake of Grace's death. Eleanor found herself trying to explain decisions that seemed inexplicable even to her, choices motivated by pride and fear and a twisted love that had ultimately destroyed everything it claimed to protect. She wrote to you, Marcus said, his voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. Every Christmas for 5 years, Grace wrote you letters. She'd spend weeks crafting them, trying to find the right words to bridge the gap you'd created. She never sent them, said she didn't want to give you another opportunity to reject her. But she wrote them anyway, because she never stopped hoping you'd find a way to forgive her for choosing happiness over your approval. Eleanor's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely. I have those letters, she whispered. The private investigator found them in Grace's belongings after the funeral. I've read them so many times the paper is falling apart. She forgave me in every single one. Even after I'd proven I didn't deserve forgiveness, she kept offering it anyway. Tears she'd held back for 18 months finally broke free, streaming down her face and destroying her perfect makeup. Grace always said you were just scared, Marcus continued, his anger beginning to transform into something more complex. She said underneath all the control and coldness, you were just a mother who was terrified of losing the thing you loved most. She defended you right up until the end, even when the cancer treatments bankrupted us, and you had the power to help but chose not to. He sat down heavily in the booth across from Eleanor, suddenly looking older than his 35 years. The sound of the back door slamming interrupted their conversation. Small footsteps pounded across the diner floor as Lily burst into the main dining area, her school backpack bouncing behind her and her blonde hair escaping from its morning braids. She stopped short when she saw her father sitting with the elegant stranger, her 6-year-old instincts immediately sensing the tension crackling between the adults. Daddy? Lily's voice was small and uncertain. She'd seen Marcus upset before, during the dark months after Grace's death when grief had threatened to consume him completely. But this felt different, charged with the kind of emotional electricity that made her skin prickle with unease. Is everything okay? You look sad. She approached the table cautiously, her piercing blue eyes moving between Marcus and Eleanor with analytical intelligence. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she got her first clear look at her granddaughter. Lily had Grace's delicate bone structure and flyaway hair, but those eyes, those impossible blue eyes that had run in the Blackstone family for generations, those belonged unmistakably to Eleanor's bloodline. The child was small for 6, but there was something in her posture that spoke of resilience beyond her years, of someone who had learned early to read adult emotions and adjust her behavior accordingly. Lily, sweetheart, Marcus said gently, I'd like you to meet someone. This is Eleanor. He paused, clearly struggling with how to explain a relationship that had been non-existent until 5 minutes ago. She's your grandmother. your mommy's mother." The words hung in the air like a prayer and a curse combined. Lily studied Eleanor with frank curiosity, taking in the expensive clothes and perfect hair with the same analytical attention she brought to everything new in her world. "Are you the grandmother who made mommy sad?" she asked with the devastating directness that only children could manage. "The one who didn't want to meet me when I was born?" Eleanor felt the question like a knife between her ribs, precise and perfectly aimed. "Yes," Eleanor said quietly, kneeling down to bring herself to Lily's eye level. "I'm the grandmother who made very bad choices because I was scared and stubborn and foolish. I hurt your mommy when I should have loved her, and I missed knowing you for 6 whole years because I was too proud to admit I was wrong." She paused, struggling with words that felt foreign in her mouth. "But I'd like to try to be better now, if you and your daddy think that's possible." Lily considered this information with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence. "Daddy says people can change if they really want to," she said finally. "And mommy always said everyone deserves second chances, even when they mess up really badly." She tilted her head, studying Eleanor's face with uncomfortable intensity. "You have sad eyes like Daddy had when Mommy first got sick. Are you sad because you miss her too?" Eleanor felt something break apart inside her chest. 7 years of carefully constructed emotional walls crumbling under the gentle assault of her granddaughter's unconditional acceptance. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "I'm very sad because I miss your mommy and because I was a terrible mother to her. I made mistakes I can't fix, but I want to try to be a good grandmother to you, if you'll let me." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of tentative revelations and careful questions. Eleanor learned that Grace had become the heart of Willow Creek's educational community, that she'd started a reading program for struggling students and organized supply drives for families who couldn't afford school materials. Marcus shared stories of Grace's boundless generosity, her terrible cooking, her habit of crying during animated movies, her fierce determination to make their modest life rich with love and laughter. Lily showed Eleanor her drawings, her collection of smooth river stones, the small garden plot where Marcus had taught her to grow tomatoes, despite the ongoing drought. Eleanor listened with an attention she'd never given to million-dollar board presentations, memorizing every detail of this granddaughter who was both completely foreign and eerily familiar. The child moved with Grace's unconscious grace, but spoke with a directness that reminded Eleanor uncomfortably of her own younger self. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation gradually turned to Marcus's background and the mysterious diagrams he'd been sketching. Eleanor's business instincts recognized innovation when she saw it, and what Marcus had drawn on coffee-stained napkins wasn't the idle doodling of a small-town waiter. These were sophisticated engineering solutions, the kind of agricultural innovations that companies spent fortunes trying to develop. "You're an engineer," Eleanor stated rather than asked, studying the complex irrigation diagrams spread across the diner table. Marcus tensed, protective instincts flaring after 18 months of keeping his background secret. In a community where most people hadn't finished high school, his Stanford degree felt like a barrier rather than a bridge. "These aren't hobby sketches. This is professional-level agricultural design." "I used to be an engineer," Marcus admitted reluctantly. "Before Grace got sick, I specialized in water management systems for arid regions. I was working on sustainable farming solutions for areas where traditional agriculture wasn't viable anymore." He gestured toward the window, where brown fields stretched endlessly toward the horizon. "Places like this, where the old ways of doing things aren't enough anymore." Eleanor studied the diagrams with growing amazement. Her years building Blackstone Pharmaceuticals had taught her to recognize genuine innovation, and what Marcus had created represented solutions to problems affecting millions of people worldwide. "This could revolutionize agriculture in drought-affected regions," she said softly. "Marcus, do you understand the potential impact of what you've developed? This isn't just about saving Willow Creek. This could transform farming across the entire Southwest." For the first time since Grace's death, Marcus felt a flicker of the passion that had once driven him to work 20-hour days in university research labs. "It doesn't matter," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I don't have the resources to develop anything beyond theoretical sketches. No funding, no equipment, no connections to agricultural companies or government agencies. And honestly, I'm not sure I want that life anymore. Lily needs stability, not a father chasing impossible dreams." But Eleanor was already thinking 3 steps ahead, seeing possibilities that Marcus had trained himself to stop imagining. She understood the intersection of innovation and opportunity, recognized the potential for genuine partnership rather than patronizing charity. "What if the resources came to you?" she asked carefully. What if you could develop these systems right here in Willow Creek, using this community as a testing ground and proof of concept? The conversation that followed stretched into evening, exploring possibilities that seemed almost too good to be true. Eleanor outlined scenarios with the efficiency of someone accustomed to turning ideas into reality: research funding, development partnerships, connections with agricultural universities, and government agencies desperate for sustainable farming solutions. But she also listened when Marcus talked about staying rooted in Willow Creek, about maintaining the life he'd built with Lily, about honoring Grace's memory by helping the community that had embraced them during their darkest hours. Lily fell asleep in the diner booth sometime after sunset, her head pillowed on Marcus's folded jacket. Eleanor watched her granddaughter sleep and felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: the simple contentment of family connection. She'd spent 40 years building an empire, accumulating power and wealth and influence that could reshape entire industries. But sitting in this small-town diner, watching the easy love between Marcus and Lily, she began to understand what Grace had chosen and why that choice had been worth sacrificing everything the Blackstone name could provide. "I want to make this right," Eleanor said quietly, mindful of Lily's sleeping form. "Not just the business opportunities, though those are real and significant. I want to make amends for the pain I caused Grace, for the years I stole from all of us by choosing pride over love." She reached across the table, hesitating for a moment before gently touching Marcus's hand. "I can't bring her back, and I can't undo the damage I caused, but I can try to build something better going forward." Marcus studied Eleanor's face in the dim light filtering through the diner windows. The harsh angles had softened over the course of their conversation, the corporate mask replaced by something more vulnerable and infinitely more human. This was what Grace had seen in her mother, he realized, the person hidden beneath layers of professional armor and social conditioning. Maybe Grace had been right to keep hoping, to keep believing that love could eventually break through even the most carefully constructed walls. "Grace always said you were worth saving," Marcus said after a long moment. "Even after 7 years of silence, even when she was dying and you didn't know and couldn't help, she still believed there was good in you that was just buried under fear and hurt." He smiled sadly, remembering late-night conversations when Grace would defend her mother despite years of rejection. She never stopped believing you could change. Maybe she was right about that, too. Eleanor felt tears she'd forgotten how to cry sliding down her cheeks, washing away makeup that had probably taken an hour to apply that morning. She was too good for this world, she whispered. Too forgiving, too hopeful, too willing to see the best in people who didn't deserve it. She looked at Lily's peaceful face and saw Grace's infinite capacity for love reflected in miniature. But maybe that's exactly what this world needs more of. The practical arrangements took months to sort out, but the emotional foundation was built that night in a small-town diner over cold coffee and impossible dreams. Eleanor had to restructure her entire life, delegate responsibilities she'd never trusted to others, learn to value presence over productivity. Marcus had to overcome 18 months of defensive isolation, had to trust that this wasn't just grief-driven impulse that would fade when reality intruded. Most importantly, they both had to learn how to be family to Lily, how to provide stability and love without letting their own complicated history overshadow her childhood. Eleanor bought a house 4 blocks from Marcus's trailer, close enough to be helpful but far enough to respect the boundaries that would need time to soften. She funded the development of Marcus's agricultural innovations through a new division of Blackstone Industries, but the patents remained in his name, the profits shared with the community that had embraced him during his darkest period. Willow Creek began to bloom again as innovative irrigation systems proved their worth, green fields replacing brown wasteland for the first time in a decade. Lily thrived with the expansion of her family, her natural resilience blossoming into confidence as she discovered parts of herself that connected her to generations of strong women. Eleanor taught her piano and French, sharing stories of Grace's childhood that filled in family history lost to years of separation. Marcus watched his daughter grow into her intelligence and curiosity, watched her understand that she belonged to something larger and more significant than their small household. 6 months after that terrible and wonderful day in the diner, Marcus found himself standing in the same corner booth where everything had changed. But now the space felt warm with possibility rather than heavy with confrontation and grief. Lily sat across from him working on homework, while Eleanor helped with math problems that had nothing to do with corporate finance and everything to do with being present for small, important moments. "Daddy," Lily said, looking up from her worksheet with the serious expression she wore when processing big thoughts, "do you think Mommy would be happy about Grandma Eleanor being here with us?" It was the kind of question that might have devastated Marcus 6 months ago, but now it felt like an invitation to celebrate rather than mourn. He thought about Grace's endless capacity for forgiveness, her absolute faith that love could overcome any obstacle, her stubborn belief that families could heal from even the deepest wounds if they were willing to choose hope over hurt. "I think," Marcus said carefully, "that your mommy always believed families could heal from anything if they loved each other enough. She never stopped hoping that someday we'd all be together, that her mother would find her way back to us." Eleanor reached across the table and took both their hands in hers, her manicure less perfect now, her clothes more practical, her entire presence softer and more accessible than it had been during those first hostile encounters. "Grace gave us each other," she said simply. "Even when I didn't deserve it, even when I fought against it with everything I had, she found a way to bring us together. That's the kind of person she was, and that's the kind of love I want to build going forward." Outside the diner windows, Willow Creek bustled with renewed energy as Marcus's irrigation innovations transformed the landscape from brown desperation to green hope. But for the three people sitting in the corner booth, the real transformation was simpler and more profound than any professional achievement. They had become family in the truest sense, not because of shared blood or legal obligations, but because they had chosen to love each other despite their imperfections and past mistakes. Lily finished her homework and pulled out her art supplies, spreading colored pencils across the table with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make any space her own. She was drawing her family now, not just Marcus and herself, but Eleanor too, all of them standing together in front of the diner that had somehow become the center of their rebuilt world. At the bottom of the page, in careful 6-year-old handwriting, she wrote, "My family," and added a small star in the corner with yellow crayon. "That's for Mommy," she explained when Eleanor asked about the celestial edition, "so she can watch over us from heaven and know we're all okay now, that we found each other like she always hoped we would." It was such a simple gesture, but it captured everything they'd all been struggling to understand about grief and healing, and the mysterious ways that love could transcend even death. Marcus carefully folded one of his irrigation diagrams into a paper airplane and sent it sailing across the empty diner. Lily giggled and chased after it, her laughter echoing off walls that had witnessed so much pain transformed into hope. Eleanor watched her granddaughter run and felt a lightness she hadn't experienced since Grace was small, a sense that the future held possibilities she'd forgotten how to imagine. The napkin that had started everything, stained with coffee and covered in Marcus's revolutionary sketches, was now framed behind the cash register, a piece of local history the diner owner insisted on preserving. But for the three people who had found their way to each other through loss and forgiveness, it represented something more personal and infinitely more valuable. It was proof that the smallest moments could change everything, that love could survive even the cruelest rejections, that families could be broken and rebuilt stronger than before. As the sun set over Willow Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that matched the hope growing in three healing hearts, Marcus understood that Grace's greatest gift hadn't been her love for him or even their beautiful daughter. Her greatest gift had been her absolute faith that broken things could be made whole again, that lost people could find their way home, and that the love of family could overcome absolutely anything, even death, even pride, even the terrible weight of years spent choosing fear over forgiveness. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but no longer empty, filled with the promise of shared birthdays and bedtime stories, of homework, help, and holiday traditions, of a love that had been tested by loss and emerged stronger than ever. And somewhere in the space between earth and heaven, Marcus liked to think Grace was smiling, finally at peace knowing that the people she loved most had found their way back to each other.